Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I have a new handheld PC review for you here today. This one is the new AYANEO Air Plus. And this one is currently on an Indiegogo campaign, and there's 3 models available. This one is the high-end model, the Ryzen 7 6800U, a chipset that we've seen in many other devices. Now the other 2 models they have up on that campaign are more budget-minded, and we'll talk about that in the next section. In this video here, we're really going to focus on the 6800U and the unique things that this one can provide. For example, this is a pretty small device for the amount of power that it has inside. The 6800U is basically the standard when it comes to those higher end handheld PCs, but as you can see, it is quite a bit smaller than some others. And of course, we'll jump into other comparisons, but a really quick comparison would be the other AYANEO Air models that they had previously. This one is called the AYANEO Air Pro, about the same size, if not a little bit smaller, with some additional different features, but then also this one is not quite as powerful either. Now, AYANEO does make other handheld devices that are just the same amount in terms of power, but they're much bigger. This is the AYANEO 2, as you can see, quite a bit bigger, but same amount of power. And so we'll do a lot of comparisons between these two as well. Now, of course, everyone's favorite handheld PC comparison device is going to be the Steam Deck. This one is quite a bit bigger than the AYANEO Air Plus we're reviewing today, but actually isn't quite as powerful as this one when you get to those higher wattages. And so when you're really trying to push performance, the AYANEO Air Plus, despite being much smaller, is a little bit better than the Steam Deck in that regard. Now, if you compare them at their absolute cheapest, you know, a $400 Steam Deck versus the $780 low spec model of the Air Plus right now, then yeah, the price difference is vast. However, you have to keep in mind that the specs on the lowest one of this is actually about the same as the high model on the Steam Deck. And so really you're talking about a difference between $650 and $780. And when you get to about $100 and $130 between the two, then it becomes a more compelling comparison. And so that's what we're gonna do here in this video today. We're gonna take a look at the Air Plus, all the features that we have inside, and whether or not it's gonna be worth that price premium over something like the Steam Deck, or even something that's already established within the AYANEO catalog. We got a lot of ground to cover, and I'm gonna try to keep this video as short as possible. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's talk a little bit about price and performance. So I have the 6800U model right here. In fact, they sent me the highest spec one, so 2 terabytes of storage, 32 gigabytes of RAM. This one actually goes for $1,200 on Indiegogo right now. However, if you want to get maybe 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage, you can get this down to about $780 before shipping. And of course, it's going to go higher when it goes to retail. And really, for this specific chipset, $780 or so is actually a pretty fair price. Now let's talk about the other 2 budget models they have available. I should start by saying that I requested from AYANEO for them to send me the low spec ones, so as soon as I get them, I'll do a review on those. But because the campaign is live right now, I do want to touch upon the pricing and just kind of the whole history with that. To start, these budget models were first announced back in June of last year, and they had a much more competitive price point. For both their i3 and AMD models, they were looking at about $300 retail for each of these. In fact, about a year ago, I made a video about this concept because I found it very exciting. I talked about the AYANEO Air Plus as well as the AYAN Loki. Those two seem to be really kind of pushing down the prices and competing with each other, but unfortunately the reality never really came to pass. For example, the AYAN Loki is still missing at this point. It was supposed to be released about 6 months ago, but even right now they haven't released a single Loki model. They're working on a 6800U model, and that's supposed to be out in the next couple months or so, but they haven't even gotten to the budget ones. So as good as those prices looked for the AYAN Loki, they're still kind of vaporware at this point. Now, the original AYANEO Air Plus models were supposed to come out late last year and earlier this year, so they're a couple months behind, but all the same, they're actually available right now, which is a good sign. However, in the months from when they released that very competitive price to now, I think reality set in, and AYANEO could not afford to release those devices at that price. And so now those budget models that were originally announced at being around $299 are now going for $599 and $650 for each. So effectively, we're looking at least double the price of what we were expecting when they were first announced last year. Now, to their credit, AYANEO made a long announcement talking about why they had to increase the prices, why they weren't happy about it, but they really didn't have any other choice. And as a gesture of goodwill, they did offer about 100 units of each of those models at that lower price point, at least initially on Indiegogo. As you can imagine, those sold out in like a matter of minutes, and so those are gone. The reality is that those budget models, which have much poorer performance than the 6800U right here, are really selling at a very similar price. I think that the price difference of about $150, $200 between those and this is really negligible compared to the amount of performance increases that you will get. And so yes, while I do want to test out those other budget models, the writing for me is on the wall. I think that something like the 6800U model, which we'll be reviewing here today, is going to be the better bet just because the price difference between the two is not as much as the performance difference. Anyway, I hope that provides some perspective of why the budget models are so much more expensive than we were expecting. I'm disappointed about it. I'm sure you are too. And I think AYANEO is as well. Regardless, I wanted to talk about that a little bit before we get into the 6800U. So let's go and dive into the specs next. I think at this point, we've probably talked about this chipset to death, so let's talk about some of the unique features. Number one, this comes with a 46.2 watt-hour battery. If you compare that to the two original AYANEO Air models, that is a big jump. And of course, we'll do a bunch of battery testing here later in the video. Additionally, they've updated the screen. So the original AYANEO Air had a 5.5-inch OLED panel that had a 1920 by 1080 resolution. These new models have a 6-inch IPS LCD panel with the same 1920 by 1080p resolution. And for me, I think that 6 inches is a really great size for these handhelds. 5.5 is just a little bit too small. So for me personally, I do think that is an upgrade. Now, the difference between OLED and LCD can be significant, so we'll also compare screens here later in the video. And really, other than that, the experience seems to be very similar. So let's actually get into the unboxing next and take a look at the device itself. Okay, starting with the unboxing here, it is very typical of what we've seen from AYANEO over the past couple years. Here on the bottom, we have some USB adapters, a charging brick and cable, and then also a variety of plug-in adapters. This one right here, I believe, is for Antarctica. In terms of documentation, there's a couple quick guides right here, but I'll also walk you through some of the basics. And then finally, we have the star of the show, the Air Plus. Now, there are a few color options. For example, there's a light blue as well as a black model, but this one right here is called Classic Gray. This is also the first AYANEO model that I've seen that has a two-tone color to it right here, which I think is pretty catchy. Now, the texture of the plastic here is very similar to other AYANEO devices. There's a slight grippy texture to it, but it also picks up on smudges a lot more than some other handhelds. And here it is after about 4 days of constant use. As you can see right here, it's picking up a little bit of your smudges here from the fingers on the front. Unfortunately, it's not quite the same here on the back. In fact, this has kind of been very typical of many other AYANEO devices, where if you do get a darker color, then you will see some of these smudges from time to time. Let's move over to controls, starting with the analog sticks. These are Hall sensor magnetic sticks, which means that they will not develop stick drift over time. In terms of overall design and size, they are basically identical to those found on a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con, but I do like the caps they use on these over the ones from Nintendo. They have a grippier outside to them, it just feels really good when you're using them. Moving over to the D-pad, this is a very familiar design right here from the original AYANEO Air. It uses a rubber membrane connection, which feels nice and classic and retro. And it does feel like it has a little bit more pivot as well. In fact, I think this is a pretty good improvement. And yes, here's a look at the original AYANEO Air Pro, and yes, this definitely has lower travel and pivot. And so I would say the D-pad on the Air Plus is a bit of an improvement. The additional height when it comes to pushing down for the travel does mean that it's going to feel a little bit more precise and nuanced when you use it, and I think that's going to come into play with precise platformers like Celeste. However, I did find when it came to playing fighting games, it was a little bit less intuitive than I was used to. In particular, it felt like I had to be much more deliberate when it came to doing diagonals, and so something like a Dragon Punch in Street Fighter 2 just took a little bit extra effort. But in the end, I do think it's a good overall standard when it comes to D-pads. It's going to be able to play the majority of your retro and modern games with ease. Also on the left side, we have our select and start buttons on the bottom, and these have a soft clicky feel to them. Now let's move over to the face buttons, and these seem to be unchanged from the original AYANEO Air. I've always found these buttons to be a little bit smaller than I would like. These also use a rubber membrane connection right here, and I think the travel on here is just about perfect. Really, my complaint here has to do with the overall size and shape of the buttons themselves. In terms of size, we're looking at about 7mm altogether in width, which is quite small compared to other handhelds. I think that the Steam Deck probably does the best when it comes to a smaller size but a nice feel. When it comes down to it, what bothers me about the size here is that there are smaller handhelds that have bigger buttons. Here with the Anbernic RG405M, you can see that the device itself is about the size of the screen on the Air Plus, but the buttons are significantly larger. They're about 1mm larger overall. And while by the numbers it doesn't seem like a huge difference, in practice it is nice night and day. Another thing that bothers me about the AYANEO Air Plus buttons is how flat they are overall. They just kind of have a 90-degree drop to them from the top to the side. Other buttons, like on the Anbernic as well as the Steam Deck, have a more rounded shape to them. And to me, this feels a lot more comfortable to use over time. Additionally, both the 405M and the Steam Deck buttons are glossy, and I think those feel really good too. And so I guess in the end, I would have really preferred that the Air Plus also had a glossy texture to them, a little bit more rounded and larger too. In the end, I don't think the Air Plus buttons are terrible. In fact, they're very functional. But it does feel like on a device with so many other premium components, these are a little bit behind. Anyway, also on the right side, we have another analog stick and then two hotkey buttons down here. By default, these are set up to bring up the iSpace app or the desktop when you press down on them. Moving over to the shoulder buttons and triggers here, the triggers are also Hall sensors like the analog sticks, which means the sensor has a magnetic connection and it's going to have some very precise input. Overall, I think the trigger travel here is just about perfect as well. Pressing down on the shoulder buttons is a fairly lightweight experience, and it's very similar to how it was on the AYANEO Air Pro. And this has a rubber membrane connection as well and feels a little bit on the mushy side. So really no complaints for me when it comes to these top buttons. They feel great overall. Let's take a look at the rest of the top. On the left side, we have a fingerprint sensor, and then we have a volume button as well as a microphone hole, and then one of two USB 4 inputs. Additionally, on the right is our exhaust for the fan. And on the inner side of each of these shoulder buttons are hotkeys that you can program. I'll show you those here later in the video. Not a lot going on the back here, just the large fan intake here on the left. Now let's take a look at the bottom. We have down-firing dual stereo speakers, and then also the other USB 4 port, as well as a headphone jack and then a micro SD card slot. I did find that the flap here was a little bit temperamental, but once you got used to the design, it was pretty easy to get it off and on. Now, in terms of ergonomics, it does feel very comfortable in the hands. Part of that has to do with the fact that it's just a really good modest size, but then also it has these slight bumps on the edges which do make it a little bit more grippable. Now, it's not like one of those big chunky grips like you can find on the Steam Deck, but overall it does improve the ergonomics. I do think that AYANEO did a pretty good job here with making it nice and rounded in the right parts, and I have been able to successfully play this for hours at a time with no fatiguing. I do think that increasing the ergonomic grips would have made it a more pleasant experience, but it would have also made the size a lot larger. And so I do think this was a fair compromise when it comes to size and comfort. In the end, all the buttons are very easy to access and it is a comfortable playing experience. Now, as we move over to comparisons, the number one device I would have loved to have compared it to is this one here, the GPD Win 4. And I reviewed this one about a month and a half ago and I really enjoyed it. In fact, this is one of my favorite handheld PCs besides the Steam Deck. Unfortunately, that was just a loaner copy, and I did order one myself, but it hasn't arrived yet. And it's really just bad luck, because this one should arrive in like the next week or two. And when it does arrive, I will do some more in-depth comparisons between these two, but for now, I did want to give you an idea of the size between the two. And looking at my older footage, here's a comparison against the original AYANEO Air Pro. As you can see, the screen on the GPD Win 4 is a little bit larger. In fact, this is 6 inches, much like how it is on the Air Plus we're reviewing today. But you can also see that the GPD Win 4 is a little bit smaller than the AYANEO Air Pro. So what I want you to do here is just kind of hold this size in your mind, and then we're going to switch over to comparison between the Pro and the Plus. And so here they are. You can see that the Pro on the bottom is a little bit smaller than the Plus on top. But you can also see with that increased size, we are getting a 1/2 inch larger screen too. And so personally, between the two, I would take the larger size while also getting the larger screen. But it will also be interesting to see the GPD Win 4 compared against the two, because after all, the GPD Win 4 is smaller than the Pro on the bottom, but it has the same size screen as the Plus on the top. Regardless, when just talking about the size here, I would prefer to have the Plus over the Pro just to have the larger screen size while not really increasing the size of the device too much. Now let's do some other comparisons for reference. Next up is the Nintendo Switch Lite. This one also has a 5.5 inch screen, and as you can see, quite a bit smaller than the Plus. Moving over to devices that have the same size screen, here's the AYAN Odin. You can see this one's a little bit more compact in size, but still keeping that larger screen. And then next we have the Anbernic Win 600. This one's also a 6-inch screen, but only a 720p resolution. But as you can see, they're about the same size between the two. Moving over to 7-inch screens, here is the Logitech G Cloud. And this one is also a 1080p resolution with a 16:9 aspect ratio like the Plus. And many other 7-inch screen handheld PCs like the AYANEO 2 right here, these ones use a different aspect ratio. This is 16:10, so a little bit taller. But of course, as you can see too, it's quite a bit larger. Same thing here with the 1X Player Mini Pro. This one has the same chipset inside as well. And finally, here's a direct size comparison between the Steam Deck and the Air Plus. And to me, this is a night and day difference between the size. Now, whether you prefer one over the other is really going to be up to you. In the end, I think that AYANEO nailed it when it comes to this size. We have a nice big screen and a hefty amount of CPU power, but then also in a small form factor. Personally, I would refer to this as being portable but not pocketable. Here's an example right here with me wearing shorts. Yes, you can put it in your pocket, but it does look a little bit ridiculous. Sure, you could definitely put this in your back pocket and walk around, but it is going to stick out and just kind of look awkward. And it's going to be worse if you use something with smaller pockets, like say a pair of jeans or some khakis. And it's probably going to be even worse if you're wearing something a little bit more tight-fitting, like women's jeans. In the end, I would recommend getting a nice case for it, but yeah, I wouldn't say this is something you can slip in your pocket and then walk around town. Finally, let's do a quick look at the weight. So we're looking at 514 grams for the AYANEO Air Plus, which is about 75 grams heavier than the AYANEO Air Pro. But bear in mind that the battery is significantly larger on the Plus than the Pro. And the Air Plus is a lot lighter than those bigger handhelds like the AYANEO 2 as well as the Steam Deck. Overall, I think that about 500 grams is certainly manageable for the Air Plus. Now, one of the advantages of having two USB 4 ports on this device means that in addition to being able to use it for things like external GPUs, both ports are also going to be capable of video out. So I'm going to use that trick right here to show you a little bit about the software experience on this device. Their main user interface is this one here. It's called the AYASpace app, and it ships with the device out of the box. And we've been seeing the same app for over a year at this point. And there's a couple things you can do right here. For example, you can scan all the games you have installed on your device and then launch them directly from the app, although I have found that launching experience can be temperamental. Really, the majority of your time is going to be spent on the right side right here. In this menu, you'll be able to do things like adjust the fan speed and then also the TDP or wattage. By default, they have 20, 15, and 10 watt settings. And then also within the Pro mode setting, you can set it from anywhere from 5 watts all the way up to 28. For me personally, I tend to keep it at the lower wattages so that I'm not draining the battery too quickly. But if you want to go to the full Monty and push it to the max of 28 watts, you would do that right here. Another one of the main features on this right side is the ability to adjust the screen resolution here on the fly. However, I found for the past year, this one has been extremely buggy for me overall. In fact, it's very rarely when I can adjust it to one of these other resolutions and it'll actually stick and not make my whole device just kind of wig out. And so generally with this right menu, I mostly just stick to adjusting the TDP and the fan speed. Now, if you tab over, there's an assistant section, and here does have two nice tweaks. To start, we have the master controller. Here you can set up your joystick and trigger sensitivity as well as rapid fire inputs for your face buttons. Additionally, you can adjust the vibration level. Personally, I like to keep it at low. And you can also enable the gyroscopic function right here as well. And really, that's about it within the Master Controller app. The other one is the configuration app down below. There's a couple things I like to do here. For example, this is where you can set those custom shoulder hotkeys. And you have 4 different total options. You can either press the buttons or hold them. Now, unfortunately, there's only 9 different options right here. I would love to see this developed further because I think it would be really handy to have a wider range of customization within these hotkeys. The other important section here is the ability to adjust the RGB lighting of the sticks. And you've got a variety of options right here, including the ability to make a pulse kind of function, and you can also adjust the colors as well. For me, I like to keep it at the defaults, which means that it's going to show blue most of the time, but then if the battery gets really low, it'll turn red, and also when you're charging it, it'll go red as well. Now, another handy function within the AYASpace app is that if you press the AYANEO button on the bottom right, it's going to bring up this, which is called the Aya Quick Tool. And this essentially will give us many of the same functions as the AYASpace app, but you'll be able to bring this up as an overlay over other games. So if you need to adjust like the TDP on the fly, this is going to be your best bet. And really, that's the extent of the software suite available on the AYANEO Air Plus. It's definitely functional, but I do find it to be buggy at times, and it also has a lot of room for improvement. And luckily, the community has recognized that, and so there are some handy third-party options that are out there. In fact, for this device, I was lucky enough to test a beta sample of a new one coming out called Handheld Control Panel. And there have been some previous versions of this floating around, but I'm really excited about this new one. Number one, this gives you a much wider range of functions, so you can do things like adjusting the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, but I really enjoy these screen options that you have right here on the fly. So you can adjust things like resolution and refresh rate, as well as put on an FPS limiter. And of course, it has a wide range of TDP controls as well. And one of the nice things about this is you can customize the home functions right here. And so if there's something you'd rather not see, you can just disable it right here in the menu. Additionally, you can set up multiple different profiles depending on the game you're playing. And you can set up a variety of hotkeys so you don't even have to bring up the menu in the first place. For example, if you hold onto these shoulder buttons and then press right on the D-pad, it's actually going to toggle this quick access menu right here, and it is super fast and responsive. In fact, it's quite a bit more responsive than the AYANEO Quick tool. And another hotkey that I use a lot is the ability to press the start button and then up and down to adjust the TDP without having to get into the menu at all. I currently have it set to go 2 watts at a time, and this is super handy when I'm in and out of a game. And you'll see me using this function throughout the rest of the video. Either way, I'm going to leave a link to the developer's GitHub profile, and so when this new one drops, you'll be able to see that right there. Next, let's move over to screen testing. And here we are at the lowest brightest. I'm going to turn off the studio lights right here so you can see what it's going to be like in the dark. And I would say at a 0% brightness, this is still very bright. In fact, I would say this is not going to be good for very dark conditions, so you're not going to want to play this in bed next to your spouse. Another thing I noticed is that after 25% brightness, the increases seem to be fairly negligible. Yes, it does definitely get brighter between 25 and 100, but it's not by much. And on top of that, I do find that 25% brightness is plenty bright. In fact, I found that in my everyday use over the past week or so, 20 or 25% brightness has been great. Overall, I would say this is a very bright screen, and somewhere between 20 and 25% seems to be that Goldilocks range. Now, one of the big differences between the AYANEO Air Pro and the Plus is the switch from OLED to LCD panels. And I know a lot of people were concerned about losing that really rich and vibrant color texture for the OLED display. But honestly, I have to say that the color profile here on the Plus is actually very impressive. I can definitely see the OLED display on the Pro has a little bit more color pop to it, but it's not as big of a difference as I was expecting it to be. If you look here at the start screen on Celeste, yes, you can definitely see a deeper blue within the mountain and sky, but I would still say it is a very impressive color range on an LCD panel up top on the Plus. Now, in certain screens, I did see a difference between the tint on the LCD and OLED panels. For example, here on the Hades title screen, I can see that the character has a little bit more of a red or warmer tone to it, whereas on the LCD panel, the character is a little bit more green. And honestly, it's a subtle difference, and when I'm only looking at the Plus, it's not something I think to myself like, hey, this screen is too green. But between the two, you can definitely see that difference. Now, when actually in gameplay, it makes it much harder to see, and so it's not something that I really had any complaints about. In fact, my overall impressions when comparing the two was that I was very impressed by the LCD panel up top. Honestly, if I had to choose between the two, I would still prefer the larger size of the Plus, even though the OLED panel is a little bit more rich. If we compare it to the Steam Deck, which is another LCD panel, you can see the difference here is night and day. And also bear in mind that with the Steam Deck, I've gone in and used a plugin to increase the saturation by about 5%. So even with that saturation boost, it still pales in comparison to the Plus at its normal settings. Another device worth comparing to is the AYANEO 2. In my review of this device, I praised the amount of color saturation. I said it was almost OLED in quality. And I would say between these two, they are very similar in that richness as well. And so again, I think the Air Plus screen is very impressive. Now let's also take a look at the bezels. Up top, you can see with a 16:9 aspect ratio screen, you do have some natural bezels that are a little bit wider on the sides and then a little bit thinner up top. Meanwhile, something like the AYANEO 2 doesn't have any visible bezels. It's kind of impressive. But also because it's a 16:10 aspect ratio, that means when you're playing 16:9 content like this, it will result in a little bit of letterboxing at the top and bottom. Overall, I would still say the AYANEO 2 is a more immersive experience just by not having those bezels on the sides. But if you're going to be primarily playing 16:9 content, you may get more bang for your buck with the Air Plus, just because it naturally has that exact same aspect ratio. And if we take a comparison against the Steam Deck, which has pretty wide bezels, you can see here in combination with the letterboxing of 16:9, it's actually quite a stark difference between the two. Again, I think that's in favor of the Air Plus in the fact that it's so compact, but also has these relatively small bezels on the sides. Long story short, yes, I'm a big fan of the AYANEO Air Plus's screen. Okay, now let's do some sound tests. We're going to start with turning the device on because the fan goes at full speed. This will give you a good indication of how loud the fan is. Overall, I would say the fan is fairly loud but not too distracting, but I did find that the max volume on the device itself was a little bit quieter than I was hoping. Thankfully, there's an app called FX Sound, which I like to use on a lot of AYANEO devices, and this will give a nice boost to the audio, but then also give you the ability to adjust it to your liking as well. Let's do a comparison here between full blast with it on and off. So overall, I would say that these stock speakers are a little bit underpowered, but with the use of this FX Sound app, it's not that bad. And finally, let's move over to game testing. This is my favorite part of every review. We're going to start with the really low end stuff and then kind of work our way up from there. I found that 5 watts seems to be the lowest that I'm comfortable with. Anything lower than that gets a little bit buggy. And at a 5 watt TDP, you can get some pretty good performance here. For example, with very lightweight games like Celeste or even Cuphead, you can play these at a 5 watt TDP and at a 1080p resolution. And it's going to give you some consistent 60 frames per second. Now, when you get beyond that, it starts to become a song and dance when it comes to the overall wattage and graphical fidelity. For example, with Ori and the Will of the Wisps, I found that I had to go to about 15 watt TDP to get relatively stable 60 frames per second. It would still dip here and there during more intensive scenes, but overall I found this to be playable. Now for me, 15 watts on a simpler game like this is just a little bit too high. It's going to drain the battery too fast. And so here's where the song and dance comes in. Number one, you could reduce the resolution down to 720p. That'll allow you to play at about 13 watts altogether with the similar kind of experience. But the more drastic improvement for modern PC games is to reduce the overall FPS. For example, if we drop it down to 30 frames per second with this game, but then also keep it at the 1080p resolution, we can actually play this at a 9 watt TDP. And you could probably go even lower if you went to a 720p resolution while also using 30 frames per second. And so that's what I mean by song and dance. You have to find a balance between the overall TDP and battery drain, while also giving you nice graphics to look at, but then a frame rate that's going to be consistent too. I found that with certain games, like driving games, I would prefer to have them at 60 frames per second. And so at that point, I'd have to drop down the resolution to 720p or maybe even reduce the settings too. For other games like Destiny 2, I found that playing it at 720p with low settings and a 40 frames per second cap seems to be the best. That gave me consistently good frame rates, but about 15 watt TDP. And as we'll see when we do the battery testing later on in the video, that's going to give me about 2 hours of playtime altogether with this game. For other games, reducing the frame rate is going to be an absolute necessity. For example, here with Control, the only way I can get a stable 60 frames per second at 720p with low settings is to crank it all the way up to a 27 watt TDP. And that's going to drain your battery super fast and also heat up the device as well. Meanwhile, if we use those same settings but drop the FPS down to 30, we can get down to 13 watt TDP. And to me, I'd much rather use that lower power draw and then just kind of getting used to that 30 frames per second feel. In the end, when it came to playing PC games, I found that I resigned myself to just typically using it at a 30 frames per second cap. I also often reduce the graphical fidelity down to 720p. Now it's a little bit ironic because this device is capable of doing 60 frames per second and then also 1080p as a resolution. But you're going to really have to crank up the power to get there, and personally I would rather have longer battery life. So it's really going to come down to you. Is the difference between 720p and 1080p worth it when it comes to that power profile? And same thing with the frame rate. If you would rather have 60 frames per second and you don't mind having that reduced battery life, then sure, go for it. And that's one of the nice things about having a pretty powerful chipset like this. You're going to be able to play just about every game under the sun. It's just a matter of which compromises you're most comfortable with. For me personally, I found that about 20 watts overall was the max that I was comfortable using with this device, and still that would give me the ability to play most AAA games at about 30 frames per second. Next, we're going to move over to emulation, and it's a similar story here. When it comes to more lightweight emulation, things like your 16-bit systems, yeah, these are all going to play at 5 watt TDP, no problem. And some of these look really good, especially when it comes to Game Boy Advance because it has a slightly wider screen overall. Additionally, given the fact that we're having a 1080p resolution, the pixels are relatively balanced even when you put it at full screen. When you start moving things up to, say, for example, the Nintendo 64 era, you will have to up the TDP to about 8 watts. And if you want to move to something a little bit more challenging, for example NFL 2K2 on the Dreamcast, you will have to bump it up to about 11 watts here. But bear in mind that I am upscaling it to 1080p as well. And it's a similar story for Sega Saturn. Here I'm using the more demanding Beetle core so I can have better accuracy, and it runs really well at an 11 watt TDP. Moving up to the next generation, Nintendo GameCube works pretty well at a 1080p upscale, and depending on how demanding the game was, I used about 12 to 16 watts for the TDP. It's a similar story with Nintendo Wii, although a little bit larger, so about 15 watts for the lighter weight games like Donkey Kong Country Returns, but then all the way up to like 18 watts for something like Super Mario Galaxy. I also tried out Nintendo 3DS, and this one worked really well at a 3x upscale, and on average I found about 16 watts to be the sweet spot for these. Now, Nintendo Wii U also had a wide range of power demands. For example, here you can see that Wind Waker HD did really well at a 12 watt TDP, but then other games required up to a 20 watt TDP to run smoothly. That would give me a solid 60 frames per second with Mario Tennis Ultra Smash. And for Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, if I capped it to 40 frames per second, this was fairly consistent as well. I would get some dips here and there when precompiled shaders would load, but overall I would say this is definitely playable. Keeping with the Nintendo theme right here, let's move over to the final system, which is going to be Nintendo Switch. For this one in general, I just found that setting it to a higher watt TDP and then letting Yuzu do the rest of the work worked the best for me. So what I did is I set it to a 22 watt TDP, and at that point basically every game is going to play at 60 frames per second with little to no problem, and these are also running in docked mode, which means they'll give you a little bit higher resolution than if you were playing them natively on a Switch in handheld mode. Now, this chipset has been well tested both on this channel and others, and so I wasn't surprised to find that this did really well when it came to Nintendo Switch emulation. And so next, let's move over to Sony emulation. We're going to start with PlayStation 2. Here, I also found that the wattage would depend on the game. For example, Fight Night 2004 ran pretty well at a 17 watt TDP, but other games had some certain unexpected and demanding spikes when it came to the gameplay. For example, Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition ran pretty well at about 14 watt TDP, but there would be some spikes here and there, and so I found that 19 watt TDP just gave me an overall better experience. And some games were just way more intensive. For example, Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal required about a 22 watt TDP. But also bear in mind that I am upscaling these up to a 3x resolution or 1080p. So you could definitely drop these down to a lower resolution to increase your battery life. Moving forward to PlayStation 3, I found that most games played pretty well at a 22 watt TDP here, and these are just running at the native 720p resolution. But I found that games like Dead or Alive 5 and Demon's Souls played fairly well here, and this is with the 60 frames per second patch on Demon's Souls. But I did find there was some limitations to PlayStation 3 emulation. For example, in the open areas of Prince of Persia, even when cranking it up to 28 watt TDP, I still was not getting a consistent 30 frames per second. So I would say if you're going to try to play an open world game on the PS3 emulator, you may not have a great time. But for most other games, they should run pretty well. Now, for original Xbox emulation, I did find that it was possible for some games. For example, here with Halo, as well as Soul Calibur 2, they played pretty well at a native resolution and a 23 watt TDP. Now, honestly, that's a lot of power to throw at this device just to be able to play the original Xbox, and a lot of that has to do with the development work that's still required with the Xbox emulator. Even then, when throwing this 23 watt TDP in certain games, for example with Dead or Alive 3, I'm not getting full speed. So I would say that Xbox emulation here on Windows is going to be hit or miss. And then finally, I also tested out Xbox 360. This I'm playing at a native resolution with a 25 watt TDP. And I did find that some of the games I tried worked out really well. For example, Crackdown and Lost Odyssey were playing at full speed. Now, much like with the original Xbox emulator, this app does have some development work that still needs to be done, especially when it comes to compatibility. So really what's going to hold you back here is not the power of the AYANEO Air Plus, but really whether or not that Xbox 360 game is going to be compatible with this emulator. So if you are thinking about getting this handheld for one of the Xbox emulators, I would definitely recommend checking out the compatibility list for either of these two apps to make sure that your favorite games are going to work. Now for this next section, I had plans to show you how a custom firmware called JELOS actually works really well with some of these AYANEO devices. This is a Linux-based custom firmware that you can boot directly from the SD card. And they've got some pretty impressive features here for the AYANEO Air Pro. In addition to supporting emulation all the way up to the Nintendo Switch, they've actually gone through and worked out all of these system settings too. So within this menu, you can do things like adjust the LED color and brightness, and you can do some pretty involved CPU adjustments, including limiting your threads or adjusting the TDP. And all of this can be done on a per system or per game basis. And so really, if you wanted to just use your retro gaming on an SD card, you could totally do this right here, and then leave the rest of the internal drive for things like PC games. This is a very similar setup to what you can find in other custom firmwares like Batocera, but with some unique features like the ability to adjust the LED and TDP. These are things that are not available within Batocera. And so my plan here was to try out this exact same SD card within the AYANEO Air Plus. Unfortunately, I found that it was not quite possible with this review unit that I have here. In fact, the boot options are completely locked down within the BIOS. The only option I have here is to go into the Windows Boot Manager, which means that unfortunately I'm not able to boot from the SD card here on this device. Now I'm hoping, like with the other AYANEO models, they're going to unlock the BIOS for the users when they do have the full retail builds. But unfortunately for me, with this early review unit, I do not have unlocked BIOS. So I'm not going to be able to test Linux distributions, including special firmwares like JELOS or Batocera. And finally, before we start wrapping things up here, let's talk about the battery life testing that I did. For me, I like to focus on real-world scenarios, and so this is what I tested here. When it comes to playing very lightweight games, for example Super Nintendo emulation or light indie platformers, when playing at a 5-watt TDP, I found that I got about 4.5 hours altogether. I think for an x86 device at this size, that is pretty impressive. I also found that an 8-watt TDP still gave me over 3 hours of battery life. I think that is also a pretty good spot right here. And so for many lightweight PC games, you should have a really good time within this category. Moving up to a 12-watt TDP, that means we can play basically Xbox 360 era PC games, and then also some various emulation at some of those higher systems. And here I found I got a little bit less than 2.5 hours overall. And for me personally, a 2.5 hour gaming session of something like Legend of Zelda Wind Waker is a really nice spot to be in. Now moving forward is when I really start to push the system, and I do have to make some compromises here. For example, here with Destiny 2, like I showed earlier in the footage, I had to play it at a 720p resolution and with low graphical settings. But with an average frame rate of 40 frames per second, it's a pretty smooth experience, and I got just a little bit less than 2 hours of gameplay. Again, for me, to have a small handheld PC that can play 2 hours of Destiny comfortably is pretty awesome. And then finally, I found that I was most comfortable pushing it to about 20-watt TDP overall. That gave me a little bit less than an hour and a half of gameplay, but depending on the game you're playing, you can get some pretty good experience here. I chose Final Fantasy VII Remake as the example because at 60 frames per second, it required 20 watts, but if I drop that down to a 30 frames per second cap, it could play really well at 12 watts. And I think that's a great example. If you're comfortable with dropping it down from 60 to 30 frames per second, you can actually get an additional hour of battery life with that game. And really, that's one of the strengths of having a high-powered CPU like this. Yes, you can play some of those harder to play games with some pretty great settings, but you can also dial it back in case you want to play for a longer period. It's really going to come down to that circumstance of where you are and how much time you have left to play. Alright, and so with all of that out of the way, let's get to the heart of the matter, and let's talk about what I like and what I don't like about the AYANEO Air Plus. To start, I think this is a great size when it comes to a handheld PC. It's one of the smallest that you can find within this range, but it still has a nice large screen. And in addition, there's enough ergonomic benefits right here to make it a very comfortable experience. I also appreciate that AYANEO likes to focus on premium components. For example, the magnetic hall sensors within the joysticks as well as the triggers feel very nice to use. I was also surprised to find that the battery life on this device was not terrible. This was probably my main concern with the Air and the Air Pro, and so I appreciate that they improved that with the Air Plus. And like we've seen throughout the video, the 6800U chipset that they're using here can play just about anything within reason. You will definitely have to make some compromises when it comes to graphical fidelity and frame rate, but all the same, your favorite game will probably play on this device. Now, of course, it isn't perfect, and so let's talk about the things I don't like. Number one is the face buttons, and honestly, with the Air and the Air Pro, I didn't mind them so much. But I feel like AYANEO is a company that is always focused on innovation, and this is one area where I hope that they had innovated. In the end, I think that the face buttons here just don't live up to the standards that AYANEO themselves have set with the other components. And I think same goes with the material that they're using for the plastic. It has a pretty good feel to it, but it is also prone to smudging. So if this is something you think might bother you as well, I would recommend sticking with the lighter colored models. Another thing that I'm not a huge fan of is the ISpace app. It's still buggy after over a year of development work. And it's frustrating when some of the very simple things, like the ability to change the resolution on the fly, still doesn't really work as intended. Now thankfully there are third-party solutions, so you're not really going to be stuck with ISpace, but all the same, I wish it worked better out of the box. Another thing you have to bear in mind if you are thinking about picking up one of these devices is that balancing act when it comes to TDP. When you play on a handheld PC, you often have to monitor your TDP, and that can get a little bit annoying over time. For me personally, I'd rather just turn on and play a game instead of worrying about whether or not I have the perfect TDP dialed in. This is something the Steam Deck does brilliantly on its own. And then finally, the other thing that's disappointing is that at least on my review unit, I was not able to boot from the SD card. And so this is something I really hope they fix in time for the retail units to ship. In the end, I think the Air Plus is a great handheld, but it may not be the perfect fit for you. If you're on a budget, I think the lower spec $400 Steam Deck is still going to be your best bet, but bear in mind it's going to be quite a bit larger than the Air Plus, and so if you're looking for something smaller, the Air Plus might be worth considering. And additionally, the Air Plus is available in all regions, unlike the Steam Deck. Now, if you're looking for a more premium experience, like a larger screen and maybe some better ergonomics, and you don't really mind having a larger size, then in that case, the AYANEO 2 might be worth considering as well. And the performance will be just about the same between the two, so it's really going to come down to what size you prefer. And finally, if you are looking at a smaller size, at this point I wouldn't really recommend the AYANEO Air or Air Pro. Number one, the Air Plus battery is much better than on the Air and the Air Pro, and you're also going to get a lot more performance and a larger screen. So if anything, I would say that the Air Plus has made the other Air models basically obsolete at this point. In the end, I ended up coming away from this review a pretty big fan of the Air Plus. When I first got it in the mail, I thought, oh, here's more of the same. It's going to be just like the Air and the Air Pro, but a little bit different. But it turns out that I think that AYANEO did a really great job on this new model. In particular, I like the larger screen, the improved performance, and the longer battery life to boot. So if you are looking at getting a smallish handheld, I do think the Air Plus is worth your consideration. It's really going to come down to whether or not this fits your budget and can play the games that you want to play. Now, if I had to choose just one small handheld PC to use, I think I would still use the GPD Win 4, but I think we need to wait another week or two until I have that one back in my hands so we can do a better comparison. Anyway, let me know what you think of the Air Plus in the comments below. Does AYANEO have another hit on their hands, or are you more interested in something else coming out from them in the future? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.